Okay. The committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, we meet today to mark up 9 bipartisan measures. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any point. Pursuant to Committee Rule 4, the chair announces that the chair may postpone further proceedings on approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements or extraneous materials on today's business. As members were notified yesterday, we intend to consider today's measures en bloc. The measures are H.R. 3190, the Burma Act of 2019, H.R. 2327, Burma Political Prisoners Assistance Act, with 11 amendment in the nature of a substitute, H.R. 1632, Southeast Asia Strategy Act, with a Wagner Amendment in the nature of a substitute, H.R. 3252, Global Respect Act, H.Res. 259, expressing the sense of the House of Representatives to support the repatriation of religious and ethnic minorities in Iraq to their ancestral homelands, with an Engel Amendment in the nature of a substitute, H.Res. 432, condemning the attacks on peaceful protesters and supporting an immediate peaceful transition to a civilian-led democratic government in Sudan, with a McCall Amendment, H.Res. 441, condemning the attack on the AMIA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in July 1994, and expressing the concern of the United States regarding the continuing 25-year-long delay in the resolution of this case and encouraging accountability for the attack. H.Res. 444, reaffirming the importance of the United States to promote the safety, health, and well-being of refugees and displaced persons, with a Liu Amendment, and H.R. 2229, First Responders Passport Act of 2019, with a Chabot Amendment. At this time, I recognize myself to speak on today's business. We have 9 good bipartisan measures before us today. I'm pleased to support them all. First, I want to discuss some of the bills and resolutions that deal with human rights. I'll start with the bill I introduced with Mr. Chabot, the Burma Act. The world watched with horror as reports came out about the Burmese military and security forces' atrocities against the Rohingya people. Now, over 1 million Rohingya refugees are in Bangladesh, unable to return home safely, and the Burmese military is using the same violent tactics against other ethnic minorities in Burma. The Burma Act will hold the perpetrators of these horrific crimes accountable and pursue justice for the victims. It also works to reform Burma's gemstone sector that is currently dominated by the military. This lucrative industry should benefit the Burmese people. It should pay for the infrastructure and economic development so desperately needed there, instead of funding the conflicts plaguing that country. We passed the Burma Act with broad bipartisan support in the last Congress, and I hope this year we get it across the line to the President's desk and help bring a measure of justice to the Rohingya people. While the Burma Act focuses on accountability for the military and security forces, we also need to hold the civilian government of Burma accountable for their crackdown on dissent. Aung San Suu Kyi's government is repressing civil society and silencing journalists. I never thought I'd ever say this, including 2 Reuters journalists who were imprisoned for 500 days for reporting on the Rohingya crisis. That brings me to Mr. Levin's Burma Political Prisoners Assistance Act. This bill calls on Aung San Suu Kyi's government to reform these repressive laws and amps up the State Department's work to support civil society and free political prisoners. It's a good bill, and I urge all members on both sides of the aisle to join me in supporting it. Next, I'll turn to Mr. Fortenberry and Ms. Eshu's measure that supports justice for persecuted minorities in Iraq. I have discussed this with Mr. Fortenberry for many, many, many months. He's worked very hard on this. This resolution condemns the tragic and horrific brutality that ISIS has wrought on religious and ethnic minorities in that country. It also calls on the United States, along with the Iraqi and Kurdish regional governments, to support the safe return and integration of these groups into Iraqi society. It includes Christians. It's a good resolution, and I'm pleased to support it. Today marks World Refugee Day, so it's fitting that we are considering Mr. Liu's measure, reaffirming the importance for the United States to promote the safety, health, and well-being of refugees and displaced persons. This measure is a critical and timely call for all of us. We must continue to support refugee protection and humanitarian response through leadership, investment of resources, and partnership. Countless brave children, women, men have been forced out of their homes by violence, conflict, persecution, natural disaster, or war. Across most of our history, there'd be no question that the United States would stand ready to provide a measure of relief to those desperate people. Today, sadly, I'm sure that commitment is in doubt in many places around the world, so I thank Mr. Liu for bringing forward this resolution that reaffirms what our country stands for, and I support moving it forward today. Next, another piece of important human rights legislation, the Global Respect Act. Throughout the world, every day, people face violence, discrimination, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment simply because of whom they love. This is about people's safety and security. We need to condemn persecution and violence against LGBT communities wherever and whenever it happens, and those responsible for this sort of bigotry need to face justice. The Global Respect Act puts visa sanctions on those responsible for human rights abuses against the LGBT community and requires the State Department to report on these issues in their human rights reports. Mrs. Cicilline, thank you for introducing this measure and for your remarkable leadership on this issue. I'm a proud co-sponsor, and I strongly support its passage. Now I'll turn to Mr. Kilday's resolution dealing with the ongoing crisis in Sudan, which I was pleased to join in as an original co-sponsor. The situation in Sudan is dire, and it's important that Congress send a strong message. Peaceful pro-democracy protesters are under attack by the country's security forces, especially General Hamidti's Rapid Support Forces. H.Res 432 condemns these human rights abuses and pushes the administration to work with international partners to resolve the current crisis in Sudan. This resolution is an important measure to show that Congress stands with the people of Sudan in their fight for a democratic, civilian-led government. I'm proud to support it, and I urge all members to do the same. Now I'll turn to Mr. Deutsch's resolution that strongly condemns the attack on the AMIA Jewish Community Center that took place 25 years ago in Buenos Aires. This one hits close to the heart. I visited AMIA twice to meet with the community there and pay my respect to the victims. It's an absolute tragedy, and frankly, it's an outrage that after all these years, there still hasn't been justice for those 85 victims and their families. This resolution condemns the attack and calls for swift action to bring the perpetrators to justice. I'm pleased to support it. I followed this case. It's a disgrace. Every time we think we're right there, something happens to push it away. Next, the First Responders Passport Act for Mr. Shabbat. This is a good bill that passed the House in the 114th Congress, and I'm glad we are considering it again now. USAID-supported search and rescue teams have played an essential role in the aftermath of many overseas natural disasters, including earthquakes in Nepal, Haiti, Japan, and New Zealand. These first responders provide specialized capabilities and demonstrate our commitment to international partners during times of need. This bill would authorize the Secretary of State to waive passport fees for the brave Americans who mobilize quickly as part of a U.S. government-supported team to help other countries when a natural disaster hits abroad. This is a common-sense fix for Americans who risk life and limb to help other countries during times of despair, and I'm pleased to move it forward. Finally, we have the Southeast Asia Strategy Act from Mrs. Wagner. Southeast Asian states have been central to the United States policy in Asia for decades, and they are key partners in advancing our interests in the Indo-Pacific region. But at this point, the United States still hasn't put together a comprehensive strategy on how to strengthen our engagement with these countries. The Southeast Asia Strategy Act calls on the Secretary of State to develop this policy so we can fully engage with our partners on some of the most critical issues facing our world today, from climate change and human rights to security, cooperation, energy, and a growing global economy. It's a good bill to strengthen our position in this critical region. I'm pleased to support all these measures, and I'd like to thank our members for their hard work. And now I'll recognize our ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today our committee will mark up 5 bills and 4 resolutions. This builds on the 26 bills and 7 resolutions the committee has already approved, many in a bipartisan manner. In particular, I'd like to thank the Vice Ranking Member, Ms. Wagner, for her bill, the Southeast Asia Strategy Act. This bill will promote U.S. cooperation with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and establish a comprehensive interagency strategy for engagement in Southeast Asia with ASEAN. ASEAN is at the center of Asia's strategic and economic future and critical to the administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. This legislation is especially important now to help us better counter China and their Belt and Road Initiative. I'd like to thank also Mr. Shabbat for his bill to give the Secretary of State discretion to waive passport fees for certain American first responders making trips abroad for natural disaster response efforts. As natural disasters can strike anywhere at any time. I saw firsthand when Hurricane Harvey hit Texas, first responders and volunteers are absolutely critical in helping victims, cleaning up debris, and restoring necessities such as electricity and clean water. I appreciate Shabbat's bill that would help these responders travel to aid a foreign country suffering from such disasters. Lastly, I'm proud to support, once again, Chairman Engel's BURMA Act of 2019. The Foreign Affairs Committee has a decades-long history of holding the Burmese military accountable for their atrocities. It's more important than ever after their genocide against their own people in August of 2017. The BURMA Act will selectively revive the sanctions regime that was recklessly scrapped during the last administration, which is long overdue. With that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to considering these bills, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. Does anyone seek recognition for the purpose of speaking on the en bloc passage? Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Chairman, just want to commend you and the ranking member once again for an outstanding package of bills brought forward in a collegial and bipartisan manner with regard to Asia. Particularly want to focus on the ethnic cleansing, if not the genocide of the Rohingya, and I'm glad that we're dealing with two bills today that deal with that. It is so important that the people of the, moving on to H.Res 259, it is so important that the Assyrians and other ethnic minorities and religious minorities of Iraq be allowed to return in safety to their ancestral homelands. And we are, of course, remembering what happened to the Jewish community of Buenos Aires and taking a strong stand to support the LGBTI community. So it's an excellent package of bills. Pleased to co-sponsor them all, and I yield back.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Engel and Ranking Leader, Republican Leader Mike McCall, for bringing these important bills to markup today. These bills address some of the most pressing issues facing the world today, and they are a testament to the bipartisan spirit of this committee. I'd like to start by expressing my strong support for House Resolution 441, condemning the attack on the Mutual Israelite Association of Argentina, AMIA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina in July 1994, introduced by my friend and chairman of the Middle East, North Africa, and International Terrorism Subcommittee, Ted Deutsch. This dastardly attack, carried out by Iran's primary global proxy, Hezbollah, tragically killed 85 innocent people and injured 300 others. But for 25 years, those responsible for this tragic attack have not faced justice. In 2006, Argentine Special Prosecutor Alberto Nisman formally accused the Iranian government of directing the attack and confirmed that Hezbollah carried it out. But unfortunately, the highest levels of the Argentinian government were also involved in the cover-up to seal Iran's role in the bombing. Nisman was found shot in the head one day before he was scheduled to present his findings on the case to the Argentinian Congress. And here we are, nearly 25 years to the day of the AMIA bombing, and not a single Iranian suspect has faced prosecution. Our hearts go out to the families and loved ones of the victims of this horrible attack. Justice must be served. I am grateful to support this measure as original co-sponsor and appreciate that Chairman Deutsch has highlighted this case and advocated for justice for these families. I'd also like to express my support for Mr. Shabbat's important measures, H.R. 2229, that would waive passport fees for selfless American self-responders traveling abroad to aid a foreign country suffering from a natural disaster. The generosity and charitable spirit of the American people are boundless. When disaster strikes, brave American men and women risk their lives to shuttle off to places many of us have never heard of to help local communities deal with some of the most devastating conditions on earth. They not only help those communities, but in the long run, they spread goodwill about America. They ultimately serve as ambassadors of our country and represent the best of the United States. The very least we in Congress can do to support these courageous individuals is waive their passport fees and send them on their way. Again, thanks to Mr. Shabbat for his great work on this bill. Lastly, I'd like to express my strong support for Chairman Engel and Mr. Shabbat's BURMA Act of 2019. The ongoing situation in Burma is beyond belief. The massive human rights abuses and unthinkable violence against ethnic Rohingya civilians in Burma are reprehensible. We have seen the tragic reports. 750,000 have already fled, 80% of whom are women and children. But even when they finally get out of Burma, these hapless refugees are packed in harsh conditions and sometimes even targets of continued violence. Just last month, 65 Rohingya refugees were found shipwrecked and stranded in southern Thailand, suspected of being victims of human trafficking. This is unfortunately an ongoing situation, and the Burmese military leaders with blood on their hands have yet to be held accountable for their crimes against humanity. That's why the BURMA Act is so critical. It would ensure sanctions, accountability, and justice related to the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya in Burma. It is our moral imperative to stand with the systematic human rights abuses of against the abuses of the Burmese military and seek accountability and justice for the victims of this heinous campaign. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you and the ranking member for bringing this slate of bipartisan measures before us today. I'm proud to support all of them. I thank my colleagues for continuing to highlight the gross injustices taking place against the Rohingya in Burma. I thank Mr. Cicilline for his tireless work to fight for equality, and I stand with him in making clear that attacks on the LGBTI community are attacks on fundamental human rights. I support Mr. Liu's effort to remind the world that we have a responsibility to those who are fleeing violence and displacement and seeking a better life. I'm also proud to stand with my colleagues in support of those peaceful protesters in Sudan who seek a democratic transition and have been met with violence. These deadly attacks must end and a civilian transition must begin. It is with a heavy heart that I, along with the ranking member of the Middle East, North Africa International Terrorism Subcommittee, Mr. Wilson, and the chairman and ranking member of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, Mr. Sires and Mr. Rooney, introduced a resolution marking the 25th anniversary of the AMIA terror attack and urging justice and accountability for those responsible for this attack. On July 18, 1994, a terrorist detonated a car bomb in the AMIA building, a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires. 85 innocent people were killed. Hundreds more were injured. And to date, this remains the deadliest terror attack in Argentina. Unfortunately, the investigations into the AMIA attack have been marked by long delays and judicial misconduct, failing thus far to bring justice for the victims, for the families, and for the community. Considerable evidence has linked this heinous attack to the terrorist group Hezbollah and to its sponsor, the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And despite warrants issued by the Argentinian justice system for Iranian and Lebanese nationals thought to be involved in the attacks and their addition on Interpol's most wanted lists, Iranian and Hezbollah operatives have yet to face accountability for their actions. After the previous president of Argentina worked to prevent Iran from being held accountable, Prosecutor Alberto Nisman heroically proceeded investigating this bombing, shedding light on the alarming and growing partnership between leaders in Iran and Argentina. Just one day before he was scheduled to present his latest findings, Alberto Nisman was found dead in his home with a fatal gunshot to the head. We are grateful that President Macri's government has continued to push for Iranian accountability, and we hope that responsible nations will comply and not afford those involved in this terror attack the opportunity to escape justice. 25 years later, Iranian-backed Hezbollah continues to carry out terror operations. 25 years later, Anti-Semitism continues to threaten the lives of Jewish communities throughout Latin America and around the world. The rise in anti-Semitic attacks, including the brutal attack on a rabbi in Argentina earlier this year, should put us all on notice that we as a global community must do more to combat hate. And with this vote, the committee honors the memory of the victims of this horrific attack, recalls the brave work by Alberto Nisman, who lost his life pursuing justice, and calls for full accountability for all of those who are responsible. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution and the other good measures before us today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. Mrs. Wagner.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you very much and the ranking member for including H.R. 1632, the Southeast Asia Strategy Act, in today's markup. I'd also like to thank Congressman Castro, with whom I founded and co-chair the ASEAN Caucus, for working with me on this legislation and for his great support of U.S.-ASEAN relations. This bill will deepen U.S. engagement with our Southeast Asian partners by requiring the Secretary of State, in consultation with other agencies as appropriate, to develop and communicate a coherent regional strategy that addresses all aspects of the relationship, from trade and humanitarian goals to diplomatic and security arrangements. ASEAN member states are vital to the prosperity of the United States economy, generating hundreds of thousands of American jobs and investing more in our economy than China and India combined. In 2015, the United States and ASEAN elevated the relationship into a strategic partnership to enhance cooperation across the economic, political, security, and people-to-people pillars of this relationship. Southeast Asian countries seek assurance that the United States is a reliable partner as they try to maintain economic independence from China and defend their territorial claims in the South China Sea. While ASEAN countries have expressed support for the Trump administration's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which promotes cooperation with India, Japan, and Australia to contain China, some worry that the focus on the peripheral waters of Asia will leave Southeast Asian states to fend off China without substantial support. The U.S. withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership further stoked concerns that the United States is no longer as committed to enhancing our trade relations. I've had many opportunities to meet with ASEAN officials and foreign ministers. One message that I hear repeatedly is that the United States must demonstrate strength and leadership in the region. Congress should listen closely to our partners who are demanding stronger leadership, and not just because China would be sure to fill any vacuum in power. ASEAN is clearly a powerhouse and a critical region to engage in and of itself. The U.S. should be proactively crafting and implementing its Southeast Asia strategy. This bill would require the administration to do just that. I thank the chairman for his attention to U.S. engagement in the region, and I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1632, the Southeast Asia Strategy Act. I thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mrs. Wagner. Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you and your ranking member, Mr. McCall, for your leadership in the slate of bills we have in front of us. Very important bills, all advancing important causes, all of which I support. I'd like to also, in particular, thank Congressman Cicilline for his leadership for the Global Respect Act. I'm pleased to be a original co-sponsor of the Global Respect Act. For too long, we've been seeing prejudice and violence against the LGBTI persons globally and here in the United States. This bill is a strong response to international human rights abuse based on sexual orientation, gender identification, or sex characteristics. And it's worth noting the timing of advancing this bill, since next week we mark an important half-century milestone. Here in the United States, we've come a long way in 50 years since the Stonewall raid and riots. But there's still more work that has to be done to ensure the LGBTI individuals have the rights and respect that they truly deserve. With the passage of the Global Respect Act, the United States will lead by example in sending a strong message to our counterparts around the world. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm bouncing back and forth between this hearing and judiciary, this markup and judiciary and small business as well, so I'll be brief. And I'd just like to comment on two of the bills we have before us today. The first is H.R. 2229, the First Responders Passport Act, which is legislation I introduced to allow the Secretary of State to waive passport fees for first responders who are contracted to deploy to disaster zones around the world. For instance, every 5 years, USAID awards contracts to a couple of fire department search and rescue teams to be able to mobilize immediately after disaster strikes abroad. Since teams have to be ready to leave the country the day a disaster strikes, these first responders must maintain active passports. However, since they are not government personnel, they have to do so at their own expense. Furthermore, the teams don't deploy all that often, so foreign travel isn't really an essential part of their jobs normally. Brave first responders represent our nation, the people who have lost everything across the globe. They shouldn't be personally required to incur this expense to do their job. Instead, our country should provide them the necessary documents so that they can bring the compassion and generosity of the American people to those who need it most. I also briefly want to mention my amendment to this legislation, which brings its text into better alignment with its intent. It limits the exemption to individuals who are truly first responders, that is, those who are under contract to deploy within a week, and so must have an active passport at all times. The second piece of legislation I'd like to comment on is the BURMA Act, of which I'm the lead Republican, and I want to thank Chairman Engel for sponsoring this legislation and working with me to hold the Burmese military accountable for its barbaric attacks on the Rohingya in the fall of 2017. Since then, I and many on this committee have condemned these atrocities. The facts bear repeating. In September of 2017, the Burmese military began a campaign to permanently drive the Rohingya out of Burma that resulted in over 700,000 Rohingya refugees fleeing from Rakhine State, Burma, into neighboring Bangladesh. They remain there today without any meaningful hope of returning home. This campaign consisted of widespread, systematic, and premeditated human rights abuses, including barbaric killings, gang rapes, and the burning of around 400 Rohingya villages. According to a partial State Department report on these atrocities, about half of the Rohingya surveyed said that they had personally witnessed a rape, while about 80% witnessed killings and the destruction of villages. Since the BURMA Act passed the House as part of the NDAA last year, there have been substantial developments in our understanding of the true horror of these atrocities as various investigations have been completed. The evidence is so bad that virtually everyone who has looked at it says these crimes were genocide and crimes against humanity. Based on this evidence, last December, the House voted overwhelmingly to adopt this resolution, determining that the atrocities were indeed a genocide and calling for accountability. It's very disappointing that after almost 2 years, the Burmese military hasn't been held accountable for these atrocities. The BURMA Act would utilize sanctions and other tools to bring about some measure of justice for the Rohingya and move Burma toward a better future. Time alone will not absolve these crimes, and it's long overdue that this legislation became law. And I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership on this, and thank all the other members of the committee that have been involved. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. H.Res.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am grateful you have called this markup and we are able to advance this bipartisan measure today. I want to thank my good friends from Florida, Chairman Ted Deutsch, for introducing an important bill to condemn the attack on the AMIA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1994. As we approach the 25th anniversary of that horrible day, I am proud to co-sponsor this bill and join Mr. Deutsch, Ranking Member Rooney, Ranking Member Wilson, and our other colleagues in repeating our calls for accountability. The AMIA bombing killed 85 people, injured 300, and shook the entire Jewish community in Argentina. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in Argentina's history. Evidence suggests that the terrorist group Hezbollah carried out this vicious and cowardly attack with the support of Iran. Yet, 25 years later, the perpetrators have not been brought to justice. The family of the victims deserve better. We in Congress must continue to call for the investigation to be completed. We should also continue to condemn those powerful interests that have sought to keep the truth from coming to light. I was honored to visit the AMIA Center in 2016 and meet with representatives of the Jewish community in Argentina who are still fighting for justice and accountability. I plan to lead a bipartisan delegation to Argentina next month to once again stand in solidarity with the Jewish community in Argentina and throughout the world. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, which sends a strong message that we will never forget what happened 25 years ago, and we will not give up until the perpetrators have been brought to justice. I thank Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall for their efforts to have this markup, and I thank all the members and their staff for their hard work. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. H.Res. Mr. Burchett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I'd like to express my strong support for House Resolution 441 and to thank Mr. Deutsch for introducing it. It's pretty clear to me and I guess the members of this committee that 25 years ago, Hezbollah committed this heinous bombing on the Argentine Jewish Mutual Association, the AMIA, and killed 85 civilians. This resolution is a stark reminder of the evil that Hezbollah has espoused since their founding in the early 80s. Additionally, we must never forget about Hezbollah's patron, Iran, who is equally culpable in this massacre and who is leading the state sponsor of terror in the world. It is safe to say that with Iranian help, Hezbollah has been able to launch many transnational terror attacks, which besides the AMIA include the Israeli embassy bombing in Buenos Aires, the attack on U.S. embassy in Beirut, the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, and not to mention the continued threat Hezbollah poses on Israel's northern borders. Mr. Chairman, the 25th anniversary of the AMIA bombing is a stark reminder that we must never forget the cowardly acts of Hezbollah and Iran, the ones that they've perpetrated over the years. And I yield back the rest of my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett. Ms. Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak in support of House Resolution 432, condemning the attacks on peaceful protesters and supporting an immediate, peaceful transition to a civilian-led democratic government in the Sudan. Protests have taken place all across Sudan since December 2018, both in response to Bashir's authoritarian regime and the country's declining economy. Bashir was removed in April after being in power for 30 years. Soon after, a transitional military council assumed control of the country, promising to negotiate a civilian-led transition to power. In June, the Rapid Support Forces, a militia linked to atrocities against civilians in Darfur, slaughtered peaceful protesters in the streets. There have been numerous atrocities committed, including bodies being found in the Nile River, the killing of a 26-year-old engineer named Mohammed Matar, and other reported cases of rape in the country, while peaceful protests have tried to press for a swift return to civilian rule. All the while, Sudanese security forces have continuously cracked down violently on protesters, used excessive lethal force, and reportedly detained hundreds. The current political crisis has the potential to destabilize the country. This resolution is important because it signals to the Sudanese population that we stand with their call for civilian rule, that we hear them, and that their lives are important. In the past hearings, I have stated my disappointment with the Sudanese security forces firing live ammunition, causing multiple fatalities in order to disband sit-ins and peaceful protests in Sudan. I'm also alarmed that the military has shut down media networks in Sudan. The social media, the internet, has been shut down for more than 17 days. I call on the Sudanese Transitional Military Council to immediately open up the internet. And it is also critical that journalists continue covering the situation in Sudan. This not only gives the international community insight about what is happening on the ground, but also boost morale for protesters. I encourage everyone to support House Reg 432, condemning the attacks on citizens and supporting an immediate peaceful transition to civilian rule. Next Tuesday, the Africa Subcommittee is having a hearing on the political crisis in Sudan with government witnesses, and I encourage you all to come and give voice to this alarming crisis. I have to say that I am deeply disappointed, having traveled to Sudan last year and was hopeful that we were moving in a positive direction in terms of our two countries, but obviously this has been a tremendous backslide. We also had planned to travel to Sudan next week, but because of the crisis, the instability, we're not going to be allowed to go into the country. So with that, I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bass. Mr. Rooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to add my voice and support to my colleague Ted Deutsch's resolution, H.Res 441, condemning the attack on the AMIA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires back in July 1994, which expresses concern over the 25-year-long delay in resolving the case and encourages that those people responsible for this heinous act be held accountable. It's critically important that this committee condemn this terrorist attack, one of the worst in the history of Latin America. And it's equally important that we recognize that those victims of the attack and their families deserve justice. For 25 years now, Hezbollah, generally backed by Iran, has been able to avoid accountability for the murders of these 85 men, women, and children. This resolution serves as a potent reminder that the United States will continue to recognize and hold responsible those who perpetrate acts of terror anywhere in the world. I want to further commend the Macri government in Argentina for its effort to find the truth behind the death of prosecutor Alberto Nisman, who was responsible for investigating this terrorist attack but was found dead with a single bullet to his head in his apartment in a crime that we don't necessarily think was an accident. And I have the fervent belief that the government of Iran was behind it. Lastly, although this terrorist attack was perpetrated 25 years ago, it should serve as a strong reminder that foreign terrorist groups do not just operate across oceans, but in our own hemisphere as well. We all know the things that are taking place on the Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil border. We must work with our strong ally Argentina and all of our partners in the region to combat the malign influence of foreign actors and hold those responsible who perpetrate crimes and terror against innocent people. I want to thank my colleague from Florida, Mr. Deutsch, again for introducing this important resolution. Thank the other people who have spoken on its behalf, and thank, lastly, Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall for bringing it before the committee for swift passage. I urge all my colleagues to support the resolution and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rooney. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to you, Chairman Engel, and Ranking Member McCall for bringing up these important bills in a bipartisan fashion, and I, of course, urge my colleagues to support all of them. I'd like to spend a moment on H.R. 3252, the Global Respect Act. It speaks volumes to the LGBTI community around the world that the United States House stands united in support of the fundamental rights of the LGBTI community to live with dignity, free from violence, unlawful detention, torture, and other indignities. H.R. 3252, the Global Respect Act, will build on existing human rights-related sanctions authorities to ensure that human rights abusers are held accountable. This legislation will require the State Department to compile a list of foreign individuals who commit violations against members of the LGBTI community and to deny or rescind travel visas for individuals who have committed such violations. It would also codify reporting requirements on these issues in the State Department's annual human rights report. As you may be aware, about 80 countries explicitly outlaw same-sex relations with the threat of imprisonment, fines, and in several countries, even death. In the past few years, disturbing efforts to target lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people and their families have passed and been signed into law in several countries around the world. Violence against LGBTI communities is pervasive and sometimes sanctioned or directed by government officials. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that, and I quote, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." As with any form of social or legal marginalization, whether based on sex, race, religion, ethnicity, or other status, the denial of human rights of LGBTI people is not only wrong, but it also negatively affects health outcomes, social stability, rule of law, and economic potential. The United States must stand up against egregious human rights abuses. The Global Respect Act will ensure that foreigners who are culpable in violations against the LGBTI community face consequences for their actions. This bill will send a signal to not just the abusers, but to the victims that the United States stands with them. Victims like Joel Simpson, an LGBTI activist in Guyana, who was targeted and beaten outside of a nightclub in June. Or Asil Belata, a 21-year-old medical student who was attacked in his own home by 2 assailants who slit his throat and wrote, "He is gay," on the wall with his blood. Or IJ, a victim of Ramzan Kadyrov's systematic rounding up and torture of men and women perceived to be gay in Chechnya. IJ described his experience of being detained and arrested by Chechnyan security forces in a report written by the journalist Elena Milashina, whose dogged reporting at the expense of her own safety brought these atrocities to light in 2017. IJ said of his attack, and I quote, "They threw me to the floor and beat me. They beat my chest and my face with their feet, and they hit my head against the floor. One of them said, 'Do not beat him until the shock stage. At that point, he will stop feeling the pain. We don't need that.'" End quote. They addressed me with female pronouns and demanded that I tell them the names of other gay people I knew. They threatened to kill me if I didn't, end quote. Or the LGBTI men and women in Brunei, where a new law imposes state-sponsored torture and the death penalty for LGBTQ people, with punishments including floggings and prisons for those convicted of engaging in consensual same-sex relations and the possibility of death by stoning. I could go on and on. This bill is simple and straightforward and will give the executive branch greater tools to punish those who target the LGBTI community abroad, whether they're part of a government apparatus or not. I thank all of my colleagues on the committee for the support of these measures and urge you to support final passage. And with this, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to put into the record a report prepared by the Russian LGBT Network, which details some of these incidents, as well as 4 news articles which recount some of the worst atrocities against LGBTI individuals around the world.
Without objection, so ordered.
And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Is there anyone on the Republican side that wishes to be recognized? Okay, Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman, and I'm proud to support all 9 bills today. I just want to speak quickly about one of them, which is H.R. 1632, the Southeast Asia Strategy Act, which I introduced with my fellow ASEAN co-chair, Representative Wagner. Together, we've introduced the Southeast Asia Strategy Act to enhance American engagement with this vibrant organization and important region in the world. For decades, the United States and its allies have established the infrastructure of security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific, generating progress for peoples throughout Asia. Our unshakable bond and commitments to regional allies bind U.S. engagement in the Indo-Pacific. Together, we work to reinforce the rules-based multilateral institutions and the international order that's proven to be indispensable, an effort in which ASEAN is integral. Even as the region transforms, the United States and its allies remain stalwarts of sustainable, inclusive development, freedom of exchange and navigation, and democratic norms. At the nexus of the region's transformation and central to its bright future is Southeast Asia. To place proper emphasis on this significant region and invigorate our partnership for the years ahead, the United States must articulate a comprehensive strategy. This bill would direct the Secretary of State to do just that. On our shared interest in economic growth, enduring peace, reliable energy, and many others, this legislation catalyzes positive cooperation and contributes to sustaining a free and open Indo-Pacific. And I was glad to work with Representatives Wagner and Yoho to help bolster a robust U.S.-ASEAN relationship. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Castro. I understand that Mr. Cires has something to add.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to add for the record that to the Cicilline resolution, that in Cuba, the LGBT community had a parade, and the government broke up the parade by beating them and breaking up the parade. So I would like to know if I can add that to the record on that resolution. They broke it up, beating them and jailing people.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support all the measures before us today, and I'm a co-sponsor of several of them, but I'd like to speak particularly about the Global Respect Act, and I want to commend Mr. Cicilline on his leadership on this issue. I'm proud to co-sponsor this legislation to ensure a strong and unwavering U.S. response to severe human rights abuses against LGBTI people. As we celebrate Pride Month, we should be reminded of the serious threats people from the LGBTI community continue to face around the world. As you have heard, in at least 68 countries, same-sex relations and relationships are criminalized. The State Department's human rights reports have shown a clear pattern of human rights violations, including murder, rape, torture, death threats, extortion, and imprisonment in every region of the world based on sexual orientation and gender identity. No one should face such treatment for whom they love. The sanctions in this legislation are an important tool to push for accountability for violations of human rights of LGBTI people. I'm also glad that this legislation will be included, and I thank Mr. Cicilline for working with me on the GLOBE Act, which is a comprehensive vision of what the U.S. leadership should be doing to advance LGBTI human rights around the world. Unfortunately, this administration, under this administration, the U.S. is ceding its role as a leader in advancing human rights, and we in Congress can't stand idly by as they try to stop the U.S. embassies from flying pride flags, appoint anti-LGBTI State Department officials, and cozy up to authoritarian regimes that are responsible for these grave abuses. I also want to take a moment to recognize World Refugee Day. I'm a co-sponsor of House Resolution 444, which underscores the important role the U.S. must play in refugee resettlement and global responses to the refugee crisis. We have a proud tradition of welcoming the world's most vulnerable, but unfortunately, that also is being undermined. The administration continues to shut out those fleeing violence, propose drastic cuts to assistance to address some of the root causes of these crises, and cut the refugee admission target from a dismal 45,000 in 2018 to only 30,000 in 2019. These are the lowest targets in modern history. The president must not abdicate the moral leadership, and if he does, the Congress has to step in. We've got to continue to welcome those who are seeking a better life and promote the safety, health, and welfare of refugees. The symbol of the U.S. should remain the Statue of Liberty and not become a border wall. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Titus. Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today is World Refugee Day, and I'm pleased that on this day the committee is considering H.Res 444, a bipartisan resolution that I introduced with Representatives Diaz-Balart, Neguse, and Lofgren to reaffirm U.S. leadership in responding to displacement crises around the world. We're currently facing the worst refugee crisis in history. According to United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in 2018, there are more than 70.8 million displaced persons worldwide. This includes nearly 26 million refugees, over 41 million internally displaced persons, and 3.5 million people seeking asylum. Put another way, in 2018, 37,000 people being displaced from their homes every single day, and about half of these refugees were children. Here at home in the United States, we've seen a drastic reduction in refugee admissions. In 2018, the U.S. resettled only 22,000 refugees compared to the 85,000 resettled in fiscal year 2016. Refugees are fleeing home because of a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. The U.S. resettlement program is critical to global humanitarian efforts. H.Res 444 reaffirms the U.S. commitment to promote the safety, health, and well-being of the millions of displaced persons. In addition, it recognizes the people and organizations who have risked their lives to provide assistance to displaced communities. And finally, the resolution calls on the Secretary of State and the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations to continue supporting robust funding for refugee protection, to set robust refugee admission goals, and to work in partnership with the international community and find solutions to existing conflicts and to promote peace and reconciliation. This resolution is supported by more than 60 organizations, including Church World Service, International Rescue Committee, Oxfam America, and Refugees International, and has been co-sponsored by 62 of our colleagues in the House. Thank you, Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall, for bringing up this resolution, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Liu. Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to support all of these bills today. but I want to speak in support of H.R. 3252, the Global Respect Act, and I too commend Mr. Cicilline for his efforts on this, because acts of violence and hatred targeting members of communities for who they are or what they believe are a threat to the moral fabric of our country and our world. We cannot let these violations of fundamental human rights and dignity go unanswered. Across the world, people are harassed, tortured, arrested, detained, and sometimes killed because of who they are, who they love, or the gender with which they identify. 9 countries, including Saudi Arabia, have laws on the books making homosexuality a crime punishable by death. Recently, Brunei codified the punishment of homosexuality by capital punishment, ultimately announcing that it would not proceed with executions for the time being in light of the international outcry that followed, but still leaving the law on the books. In the Russian region of Chechnya, a coordinated strategy of purges, detentions, and executions has terrorized the LGBT community. Despite being part of the Russian Federation, the local authorities in Chechnya have been left free to operate with impunity. The Global Respect Act would take a crucial step in saying unequivocally that LGBTQ people must be free from being targeted, attacked, or imprisoned on the basis of sexual orientation or gender. By requiring the State Department to track individuals responsible for violations against members of the LGBTQ community around the world, and denying or revoking visas for individuals who have committed such violations, we will send a clear message to allies and adversaries alike that LGBTQ rights are human rights. By passing this legislation, we have the opportunity to place our country firmly on the right side of history, affirming that we call for respecting the rights and dignity of all people everywhere. I encourage my colleagues on this committee, on both sides of the aisle, to pass the Global Respect Act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Wild. Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to commend you and Mr. McCall, the ranking member, for your leadership and your work on this. I feel, as a new member of the Congress, that the work of this committee is a real model for the House and for the whole Congress in terms of how we work together in a bipartisan way. And I want to speak specifically to urge my colleagues to support the Burma Political Prisoners Assistance Act, H.R. 2327. In the past couple of years, there has rightly been a lot of attention on the horrific crimes against the Rohingya people. It's a genocide, and we have an obligation to act both as policymakers and as human beings. But far less has been said about those who are fighting to shed light on that crisis and share the stories that are sadly so dangerous yet so important to tell about the Rohingya situation and other human rights violations in Burma. I'm talking about people like Wa Lone and Cha So-u, Reuters journalists who were arrested while investigating a massacre of Rohingya men and boys and spent more than 500 days in prison before being released last month. Even now, they have not been officially exonerated of the false charges against them. Their stories are indicative of a much, much bigger problem when it comes to free expression in Burma. There have been crackdowns on peaceful protesters. There was the arrest of Aung Ko Twe, a former child soldier who gave an interview talking about his experience being abducted and forcibly recruited by the Burmese military at the age of 13. For that, he faces up to 2.5 years in jail. While our State Department and USAID are working to aid political prisoners, more needs to be done. That's where this bill comes in. We need to support efforts to change or repeal the very laws that are being used to stifle free expression and honest reporting, and that were used to imprison people like Wa Lone and Cha So-u. Many of these laws date back to the colonial era. We should support the creation of an independent prisoner review mechanism to examine cases like these and offer recommendations as to how the law might better protect free expression. And we need to make clear that this Congress is united, Democrats and Republicans, in our support for a free press, freedom of expression, and the fundamental rights of the Burmese people. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this bill up today, and to your staff for their hard work. And I want to thank in particular Congresswoman Wagner for partnering with me to introduce this legislation. I urge my colleagues to support it and the entire package, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Ms. Spanberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to speak today in support of House Resolution 432, condemning the attacks on peaceful protesters and supporting an immediate peaceful transition to a civilian-led democratic government in Sudan. I am incredibly supportive of this effort because it is so vitally important for us as members of the United States Congress to stand up for civilians and those who are using their voices, those who are trying to impact change in their own communities through peaceful transitional efforts. I also speak in support of this resolution because I have a substantial Sudanese American community who have family members and friends impacted, who are fearful in the streets of their home country as they try to lift up their voices, as they try to peacefully protest and impact change within their country. And it's today in support of them and in support of the peaceful protesters who are seeking a transition to a civilian-led government that I ask all of my colleagues to support House Resolution 432. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Spanberger. Mr. Costa.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. To you and to the ranking member, today is a very good day for the House Foreign Affairs Committee because all of these pieces of legislation really speak to the moral high ground that I think reflects American values of human rights, American values of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to gather. Let me just point out a couple of the pieces of legislation that I think, for me, are personal. The impacts of U.S. leadership in responding to displacement of refugees around the world is something that has always, in the past, stood out for America as a beacon of light around the world. And the refugee crisis that we have on our own borders is one that reminds us of the fact that we have a role to play. Anti-Semitism, sadly, continues to still exist around the world, and it's fitting and appropriate that we recognize the attack that took place in July 1994 in Buenos Aires, reminding all of us that, in fact, anti-Semitism still, sadly, today occurs around the world, and we must call it out for where and when we see it. Having been to Sudan, I can tell you that the resolution H.R. 432 is fitting and appropriate. The horrific violation of human rights in Sudan has been well known and demonstrated. And clearly, even with the change of the horrific regime that perpetuated the violation of human rights, we still see people suffering in Sudan. We must call it out for what it is. Clearly, America, as a beacon of religious freedom throughout our history, it's appropriate that the ethnic and religious minorities in Iraq, a part of the world that many of us have been to, in which we've expended a great deal of American resources, we must remind those in Iraq that they have a responsibility in this area. Finally, as was noted before by my colleagues, it is Gay Pride Month, and the LGBTI community has had a long and difficult journey, not only in our country but around the world. Countries in which these abilities of people to enjoy their own basic human rights, to love the persons that they choose in consensual relations, in some parts of the world we know is punishable by death. And that is simply unacceptable. And so these pieces of legislation separately and taken together, I think make an incredibly strong statement today for the Foreign Affairs Committee and a tribute to the leadership on a bipartisan basis that America is still a beacon of light and that we still, as a country, can come together and maintain the moral high ground. And I think this package of bills reflects that sentiment, and it's something that we should all be proud of today. I'll yield back the balance of my time, but I want to commend my colleagues and the authors of these fine pieces of legislation and look forward to supporting the entire package. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Thank you, Mr. Costa. Are there any other members seeking recognition? Hearing no further requests for recognition, then without objection, the committee will proceed to consider the noticed items en bloc. The reporting quorum is present, and without objection, each measure is considered as read, and the amendments to each are considered as read and are agreed to. The question occurs on the measures en bloc as amended, if amended. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The measures considered en bloc are agreed to. And without objection, each measure is ordered favorably reported as amended, if amended, and each amendment to each bill shall be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any technical and conforming changes. And this concludes our business today. I thank all the members of the committee, especially Ranking Member McCall, for their contributions and assistance with today's markup. The committee stands adjourned. Let me just say, for those of you who want to take a photo to show your blue for Sudan, we'll be doing it quickly right after we end, which is now. Thank you very much. Committee is adjourned.